Why bother with history? An Introduction to the Study of the History of Psychology, Part 3 of 3. Psych 182, History and Systems of Psychology, Professor Michael Botwin, Department of Psychology, California State University, Fresno. In our last unit on introductory comments, we'll be talking about different forms of determinism. There are many discussed in the first part of the chapter, but look at the ones we're talking about here specifically. We'll get to the rest as we go through class. The first form of determinism we're going to discuss is biological determinism. Biological determinism is relatively simple. It's behavior that is caused by biological processes. Now, this has been expanded to include things like genetic consequences. In other words, the basic question here is, are we born a certain way? As a personality psychologist, I can tell you about 70% of the variation in major personality traits, things like extroversion, neuroticism, things like that, can be attributed to genetic influences. So biological determinism is simply biology determines our behavior. The second form of determinism is the exact opposite of that. It's environmental determinism. Now, environmental determinism is based on features of the environment and how they cause behavior. The picture I'm using here is from one of the rides at Disneyland. And you can see that this line has been engineered to keep order. In fact, if you go to a place like Disneyland, they construct the environment so that you move through it the way they want you to move through it. So you pass through different things at different times. In fact, the thing that I found interesting from an environmental point of view, my last trip to Disneyland, was that you wait in line, get in a ride, you go on that ride, and then you get out, and you're aroused from being on the line. Our second form of determinism is environmental determinism. Now, environmental determinism, the environment causes behavior. If you've ever been to Disneyland, your behavior has been largely determined by the way that the Imagineers have constructed the environment. If you go on a ride, you wait in a long line that's engineered to keep everyone in order, like this one at It's a Small World. You go on the ride, and then after being excited by being on that certain ride, you walk out into the gift store in to buy the pictures. So the environment is set up at Disneyland to get the most of your money that it possibly can. Socioculturalism. Sociocultural determinism states that the rules, customs, and features of a society in turn cause our behavior. So we live in a Californian culture, at least those of us from California State University viewing this video do. And there are certain aspects to living in California and the California lifestyle that in turn cause our behavior. On a global level, there may be differences in human behavior due to major cultural variables such as collectivism versus individualism. And it's true, the rules of a behavior, or a culture, do determine to a large part your behavior. Finally, there's indeterminism, which says that it's impossible to come up with any causal explanation, and it's just impossible to determine, so you do a Tony Soprano and you just say, forget about it. The non-determinism is the rejection of science and the scientific method. You may accept a religious view or something non-scientific, but non-determinism means that you're not looking for those root causes. Our final view here is interactionism. Now, interactionism is the most reasonable approach, in my opinion, to looking at the causes of our behavior. And interactionism simply states that our behavior is caused by a variety of factors simultaneously. These can include our biology, including our genes, the environment we're in, and our past, which may have been influenced by sociocultural rules and things like that. So any behavior we perform may be the result of multiple causation. The nature of human nature. What are the historical relationships between the mind and the body? There are several potential relationships between the mind and the body. First of all, let's talk about materialism. Materialism says simply that matter is the only physical reality, and we are simply the sum total of all of our biological, electrical, and chemical relationships. And by default, all materialists are monists. We'll describe monist shortly. Simply put, the monist state that everything can be explained in terms of one reality. There isn't a spiritual and a material world. They're the same. Dualism is the idea that the mind and body are separate entities. We have a mind and it's separate in systematic ways from the body. This is an important idea, and it's one that in philosophical times past allowed for a split of the mind and the body and the development of pure philosophy. So it's an important idea to keep in mind. We'll come across many kinds of different dualism as we go through this class. The idea of interactionism is the notion that the mind and the body interact in systematic ways. However, they're separate entities. They just work together occasionally. Please note that the textbook talks about many different kinds of dualism, like psychophysical double aspectism. That's my favorite long-winded phrase for dualism. It doesn't make sense to talk about these until we get into a context of the philosophers who created these ideas. So skim over that material in Chapter 1, but don't spend a lot of time memorizing it. It's not worth your time. Nativism emphasizes the role of inheritance of individuals' characteristics. So this could be biological, physical, and in some cases, according to some theorists, psychological. We know, for example, in personality psychology, that about 70% of the variance in major personality traits is heritable. For example, even though I talk for a living, I'm a very shy guy. We know that shyness is very heritable. And my parents both are relatively shy people, and I inherited their shyness. You can do some things to get over things like shyness, but that's the personality class for you. Another view is the empirical view, empiricism. Now, empiricism is a different idea than the use of the word empiricism today. typically, if we talk about empiricism today, we're talking about doing empirical research. We're talking about how people would, in turn, do data analysis, do research, empirical stuff. In philosophy, empiricism says that you basically take information from the external world and you start with no knowledge at all. This view has also been called the blank slate, the tabula rasa. It goes back many places, but most notably it goes back to John Locke. So everything we learn becomes part of our knowledge, part of our being. So the empirical view emphasizes learning on an organism's behavior. If we haven't experienced something, we can't understand it or know it. Still another view is the mechanistic view. And this is the notion that behavior can be explained in terms of mechanical laws. As an old mechanical designer draftsman, I tend to be very much of a mechanist. And there are several things that are derived from the study of organisms as mechanisms. And the mechanistic view basically says that all behavior and bodily functions can be explained in terms of their parts and the laws governing those parts. So one way I might be able to understand an organism is to take it apart, whether I reduce the behaviors down to their elemental parts, or I'm looking at a brain and I'm looking at the different distinct parts related to different functions there. One of my favorite movies of all time is the movie Young Frankenstein. And before we introduce the next topic, let me show you this quick clip. Alive! It's alive! Okay. Besides giving me a chance to get cheesy and have a little fun, why is Frankenstein important? Well, the original novel, Frankenstein, goes back to Mary Shelley in the 18th century. Maybe the 19th, doesn't matter. And people were just discovering the idea of electricity then. And there came two schools of thought about how we functioned. One was the view of the vitalist. The vitalists basically are saying that there is this vital force that all living things possess. Doesn't extend to inanimate objects, but only to living things. Now, you can, in turn, call this vital force the soul, the spirit, or the psyche. How about that? And the vital force gives an organism its energy. Remove that vital force, and the organism is dead. Inanimate versus animated. So, people were scared about electricity in Mary Shelley's time. They were just discovering how electricity could be used, how it could be controlled. Frankenstein is a story that comes out of that notion. Can you, if a body is just missing its electricity and is dead, reanimate a dead body by recharging it with electricity? Now, you may think this is a silly notion, but think about cardiac arrest paddles that you see located strategically in some places and are in hospitals, and EMS folks carry them. Someone has cardiac arrest, they have a heart attack, their heart stops. You can put the paddles on their chest, give them a jolt of electricity, and start the heart beating again. Now, you can't, at this point in time, do what Frankenstein did and take a body that's been dead for a long time and reanimate it, but we can do a little bit of that. So vitalism is the idea that we have this vital spark that gives us our life force, our life energy. Furthermore, this vital force departs when the body dies. So it becomes all... So, this is our introduction to the history of our field. We're going to move on to putting these into the context of different historical psychological theories that are important in the development of our field. Hang on, it's going to be a bumpy ride. This has been a We Have Couches video production. Copyright 2020, Professor Michael Bontwin, all rights reserved.